ask that you do have your video camera on. If you're a place that's not safe or not comfortable, by all means, leave that video off. If you're a member of the public dialing in, we certainly appreciate you engaging in this conversation. We do ask that until we get to public comment, you leave your video camera off. And on that note, if you're a member of the public who would like to address this subcommittee on housing of the 1296 Task Force, we will have a block of time at the end of today's call for public comment. And I would just ask that at some point during our conversation, you drop a message in the chat to myself, Barrick Abramson, or to Carrie Steele. And on that message of chat, my other request is that everyone, unless you are asking to talk about during public comment, that you refrain from using the chat. It can be distracting for our members, particularly anyone using a screen reader or other technologies. So we try to avoid using the chat unless absolutely necessary. If you do need to contact me, just send a direct message directly to me, and that's fine. With that, I want to quickly go over our agenda and then get right into some introductions. We've been taking all of the requests and conversations we've been having with all of you to bring in some additional expertise. So today's conversation will feature two panelists that can offer perspectives both from the state as well as the local affordable housing development perspective and from the federal, from HUD. We're working on some additional guests, including some folks from CHAFA for future meetings. But as you all know, we're starting to get onto some tight timelines. Our goal is going to be to develop our recommendations over the summer and early fall. And just to remind everyone, as I frequently do, what our charge is. This subcommittee is charged with submitting a report with our findings and recommendations, addressing the current need for an inventory of accessible housing in Colorado, the projected increased need for accessible housing in the next decade, and recommendations to meet future housing demand, including financing for low-income housing development and any other statutory requirements this task force considers. So over the summer, we're going to shift gears dramatically from just discussing and brainstorming and learning and really starting to put ideas on the table of everything from what needs to be regulated or legislated, what needs to be enforced, what are some best practices that you all want to recommend. We'll also talk about some logistics at the end of today's meeting, but I want to get quickly to our panelists and for our panelists to know who they're talking to. They've been given an overview of the task force and the legislative charge and what the subcommittee is, but I want them to get a chance to understand who's on the phone or who's on the screen. So I'm going to ask each member, and Brian, I'll start with you, and then I'll go over to Karen, to introduce yourself by your full name, what organization you represent, and what perspective or lens it is that you feel that you're bringing to these conversations.
Sure, thank you, Barrick. My name is Brian Rothford, and I'm the Executive Director of Housing Colorado. We're a nonprofit membership association in the affordable housing space. And I think the perspective I bring is kind of a broad industry perspective for affordable housing. We represent everybody from contractors to tax accountants and developers. So I think that's me.
Thanks, Brian. Let's go to Karen and then Anais.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Kallenberg. I'm the Executive Director for Habitat for Humanity of Colorado. We're the state organization serving 24 affiliates that are building in 45 communities across the state. And we are a home ownership developer. And so I bring that perspective. And we also do a lot of owner-occupied repairs and working with owners in terms of aging in place. So have that perspective to contribute.
Thanks, Karen. Anais and then Cassidy.
Hello, my name is Anais and I'm a disability advocate with the ARC of Larimer County. My main role with the ARC is supporting individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities in navigating complex systems, housing being one of the major ones currently. And so I work a lot with clients interacting with their property managers and housing authorities to make sure that those practices are accessible to them.
Cassidy and then Paul.
I am Cassidy Roberts. I am an attorney at Disability Law Colorado. We are the state's protection and advocacy system. A lot of my work is just dealing with compliance with the Fair Housing Act and Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act and doing varying levels of assistance for folks, anywhere between self-advocacy and just explaining what the law is and all the way up to direct representation.
Thanks, Cassidy. Paul and Rochelle.
Hi, my name is Paul Brady. I am an architect and I design residential structures, everything from private homes to multifamily. And I think I bring that perspective of understanding how to, um, the implementation of the physical design strategies. So,
Thanks, Paul. Rochelle.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rochelle Mitchell. I'm the CEO for Connections for Independent Living, one of the 9 centers for independent living in the state of Colorado. I'm also the chair of the Association for Colorado Centers for Independent Living, representing those agencies. We serve people with disabilities in the state of Colorado, ensuring that the ADA compliance is advocated for at all levels of government and community, and providing people with opportunities to live their lives independently, regardless of their disabilities. I'm here because about 5 years ago, we saw an 800% increase in people that needed accessible living conditions, and the CILs have been pretty overwhelmed with that task for the last many years, especially ramping up since COVID. So that is one of the reasons that I'm here today.
Thanks, Rochelle. And Shelley, I know we're getting you while you're at the airport and route places. Are you in a place where you can come off mute and say hello?
I can. Good afternoon, everyone. Shelley Marquez. I'm the president of Mercy Housing Mountain Plains. We are a national nonprofit affordable housing developer. Our corporate office is in Denver, and I'm bringing the perspective of a affordable housing developer. So good to be on the call today.
Thank you, Shelley. And as usual, we have the Lieutenant Governor, Diana Primavera, on, who has been a tremendous supporter of this work, not just throughout this task force, but for most of her professional career in the last few decades, along with her senior policy advisor, Josh Winkler, a number of staff from DORA and the Civil Rights Division. So we thank everybody who has joined. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce our 2 panelists. And you received their bios by email, and I'm not going to try to repeat those. I'll let them introduce themselves. I think we've got 2 really interesting perspectives. Pat Coyle, who is currently the executive director of the Atlantis Community Foundation, but Pat also comes to us with pretty in-depth experience at the city, state, and federal level. He was the director of the Division of Housing. He was the deputy executive director for DOLA. He was the housing manager for Denver's Road Home. So we've got Pat Coyle, and then from the federal side and HUD, we have Amy Gioletti. And Amy, if I'm mispronouncing your name, I apologize, and I'll invite you to correct me. But why don't we start with our 2 panelists? And Amy, I'm going to ask you to start. And if you could just give folks a sense of your path, what your current position is with HUD, and kind of what that portfolio when it comes to enforcement and programs looks like, and what your path was, so people understand your journey and your exposure to some of the issues that this group is tackling.
Sure. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Amy Gioletti. I am from HUD. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. In many ways, it feels a little bit like a homecoming. I started my career with HUD after graduating from law school as a presidential management fellow, and I actually started out in the Denver regional office. And so I lived in Denver for a couple of years, and I've had a bit of a winding path to my current position, which is the acting director of the Compliance and Disability Rights Division in the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. The perspective that I bring to this conversation is pretty similar to, I think it was Cassidy, her perspective from Disability Rights Colorado. Our office, of course, the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, is HUD's civil rights enforcer. And in particular, our division investigates fair housing compliance with all of the federal civil rights laws, including the Fair Housing Act, as well as Section 504, to some extent the ADA, and any other of the authorities that HUD enforces, such as Title VI, that are applicable to recipients of federal financial assistance. We also provide technical assistance to developers and builders of multifamily housing developments through our Fair Housing Accessibility First program, which provides really a one-stop shop of free technical assistance, training resources, as well as a hotline that is staffed every single day and has about a 95% turnaround, 24-hour turnaround, to respond to questions related to design and construction accessibility from builders, contractors, and the like. So the portfolio is really across the board, from investigating individual complaints of discrimination by persons with disabilities, providing technical assistance. A lot of that is related to reasonable accommodations or modifications, developing policy, and again providing technical assistance related to design and construction. So hopefully that answers, but it's a pretty broad spectrum across the board.
That is super helpful. Thank you, Amy. And Pat, if I could get you to jump in, and for those who haven't had the chance to get to know you here in Colorado, if you could share your background and some of the work that you're focused on right now.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me today. I guess I've been in Colorado over 40 years. So if you haven't run across me, I apologize. And if you have, I apologize as well. So I do have in addition to being in Colorado that long, my background is in affordable housing is over 50 years. And it runs the gamut of federal, state, and local programs, as well as at this point as a nonprofit developer. I am currently the executive director of Atlantis Community Foundation. Lucky for me, we have a very, very narrow mission. And that is we build affordable housing for people with disabilities. And we don't slice that in any different way. It's across the board. And by that, I mean everything we build is adaptable and accessible. So we have just over the last 3 years completed new construction of 144 affordable units. We start construction on another 60 in about 2 months. So we're very fortunate to be able to compete for resources and be awarded the financial resources that are out there. In addition, Atlantis Community Foundation, we manage over 500 rental vouchers, again, for people with disabilities. And that runs the gamut of both federal type of vouchers as well as state-funded vouchers. In the roles that we work in, we see both the path forward to providing more housing, but that's both affordable and accessible. As well, we see the barriers, and I think, and I will certainly stop at this. I think there's an awful lot of myths that we are working in as to how much or how little it takes to really build housing that is accessible for folks. I guess the one other thing that I will throw out there is what we are aiming for. We think is always the biggest challenge. The challenge of building housing for people with disability to live independent, we are doing. To build housing for people who are dependent upon 24/7 services is going to be our challenge moving forward. And several people are tackling that issue right now, and we hope to be certainly one of the successful ones. Thanks.
Thank you, Pat. And for members, I'm going to start this off with a couple of questions for our panelists based on some of their introductory remarks and some of what all of you have talked about. But my intention is for this to be a pretty casual and informal and primarily driven by you as this subcommittee membership. So after I ask a couple questions, I'm going to ask each of you to lean in, raise your hands, and ask questions of one or both of our panelists. Pat, I'm going to pick up on your comment about what the challenges are and are not. And I would love to hear from your time now at Atlantis, but also from the lens of when you were with the Division of Housing. If this group could really make one or two big strides in the state financing system or the oversight systems, where do you think would be the most impactful ways that they could lean in?
Well, that's a great question. I start with the simple things that are in front of us right now that may bear, I would hope, a lot of opportunity and fruit for the community. And you know, Amy knows from HUD's world, anything that is financed federally, we are setting aside 5% of those units. As a minimum. The question is, are we sure that people with disabilities live in those units? And it's easy to find out. And I would encourage that to be at the top of the agenda for folks in the financing world who have to regulate the occupancy of those units that are already built. And so and following that, if it is found that they are not occupied the way they should be, start a very efficient system of referral. And we will find that throughout Colorado, there are units that that are already in place that we need to take advantage of. Secondly, I do think one of the myths when we approach from a design standpoint, we simply build units with a little more square footage and a little difference in doorways, and from there, it's easy to adapt that unit to be accessible by pulling out cabinets, by adding grab bars, by installing sensory devices, by adding different services. What we hear is that it's costly, and that doesn't. Yeah, it's a matter of starting out with the design. Where it does come in, where it is mostly costly, is when you're talking about renovating and rehabilitating units. Those are approaching the challenge of building on the inventory and increasing the inventory. I lean toward those things that we can construct and get developers like myself and for-profit to really just move their designs a little bit to increase their square footage, if nothing else. And that way you can pretty easily adapt those units. Certainly from there are much larger things, policy things to talk about, but I'm all about starting simply.
I appreciate that. And we'll start with the simple. Amy, I'm going to transition with kind of picking up on a point that Pat made, and I want to talk to you about the federal role. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about the broader federal programs and role. But Pat brought up the fact that there's a requirement for this set aside. And it's frankly a little bit of a black hole or a black box of what happens once they say that they've got those units. What is the role of HUD in enforcement, in ensuring that those units are set aside and that they're utilized for their intended purpose? And what, if anything, could Colorado do to strengthen that?
Yeah, that's a big question. So as Pat said, the under Section 504 for new construction, multifamily, or for substantially rehabilitated multifamily, the current requirement is that there's a floor for 5% or one unit, whichever is greater, to be accessible for people who have physical disabilities that would require the physical accessibility of the unit, plus the additional 2% or one unit, whichever is greater, for hearing and or vision impairments. The public housing authorities who administer the program, as well as the multifamily housing authorities on the project-based side, are required to have to ensure that the units are available to people who require the features of those units as a first priority. So there should be a tenanting priority for the units. And then secondly, there should also be the public housing authorities in particular should be operating from or maintaining a list of accessible units that are available in the community. So there are two different issues. One is the multifamily housing, right? So we're talking about the hard units that the public housing authorities administer, or including multifamily units that might be project based. But then a large portion really of HUD's portfolio has moved to the voucher system. And that can also be especially problematic because, as probably most people know on this call, if you're dealing with a private landlord who accepts a voucher from someone who is who receives a HUD voucher, Section 504 would not apply in terms of that private landlord being required to pay for a modification to the private rental unit. So I guess I'm answering your second question first. One of the things that I think about and that I've seen in terms of a best practice, and I don't know, this may be occurring to some degree in your state or with local public housing authorities, but whenever you have an individual who is in receipt of a housing choice voucher or a special purpose voucher, and they're searching for a unit on the private rental market, first of all, it can be incredibly hard to find a unit that is suitable for any family. But then whenever you add the need for accessibility to it, it can become even more challenging. And so I would encourage to ensure that, to the extent feasible, that those public housing authorities or your local nonprofits like the Centers for Independent Living or any other organizations that provide resources around accessible units would maintain a list of potentially the private market units as well that have some accessibility features. They might not be 100% accessible, but they might have a feature that was installed in the unit that a person could benefit from. And they would have no way of knowing about that unless there's a coordinated effort and partnerships available in the community to maintain that kind of information. So that's one thing that I would think about. The second too is that public housing authorities that I have seen, there are certain public housing authorities that have been able to develop partnerships or other funding streams so that they can provide a certain level of funding for a reasonable accommodation in one of those private market units, so that the financial burden would not fall on the individual who needs the modification. So that's one thing to think about as well. And I think overall, I'm just sort of underscoring the need for partnerships, which it sounds like you all are working on in this group, and you have kind of a wide variety of people here who are working from different perspectives. But from HUD's perspective, getting to the first part again, the units with the accessibility features should be made first available to people who require the features of those units. And we engage in compliance activities to ensure that public housing authorities and multifamily housing providers around the country are in compliance with Section 504, as well as other federal laws like Title VI, and to a limited extent the ADA. it can be challenging from a resource perspective because there are approximately, I think, about 40,000 HUD-assisted housing providers across the country. And from a staffing perspective, we can't get to everyone. And so we try to get to as many as we can to ensure that we can conduct compliance reviews in addition to investigating individual complaints that might be filed alleging a violation along those lines.
Thank you, Amy. Members, I'm going to ask one more question of our panelists and then invite all of you to really drive the conversation here. And Pat, I'll go to you first, and then Amy, I'll ask you a variation of this. But Pat, a big part of our discussions has been where these units are. And we started with a charge of how many units does the state need and how many units will the state need? And members quickly zeroed in on that's really not the detail we need to get to. We need to get to where are those units needed? And I'm curious from your perspective, Pat, as we look statewide, as we look at an aging population and the different needs that different individuals may have, whether that's a physical disability, a cognitive disability, whether they're blind or deaf and other challenges, as well as just the geographic diversity of our state. What can be done by the state to incent, to drive, to require, and to make more units more geographically distributed where they're needed rather than consolidated in urban corridors?
Well, I will start at the end of your question, and I think you said rather than urban corridors. I only say this because certainly that's where a lot of the public transportation is located, and that's key to citing a property for Atlantis and for if you're going to be at least building.
I should probably have said in addition to urban. So
okay, that's fair.
Yeah.
So and I think the state is tackling some of that issue right now with proximity to public transportation and looking at incentives. Secondly, I guess I'm going to show my bias. I don't believe that you regulate this. You're regulating right now that everybody have 5%. I'm questioning if that's true. And the reason I question it because where it breaks down is when a unit is unoccupied and you're trying to market that unit. I think it might be 60 days, might be a little longer, that you have to have someone in place, a legitimate referral, a qualified referral, or you can lease that unit to someone who is not disabled. So rather, I approach and through incentives. In that case, how you fix that is you do have a centralized referral system, whether it be in a rural community or in an urban setting. And then the last piece, I guess I would add to this is I do believe this is to the voucher question as an incentive. Atlantis, we do administer over 500 vouchers for people with disabilities, and we do that under contract with the state of Colorado and the Division of Housing. I do believe that not only should Atlantis, but local housing authorities use that type of voucher as an incentive for builders to project-base those vouchers, to prioritize those vouchers for folks that have a disability, whether they be it is a mental or physical disability, so that opens the door wide on a conversation of that partnership that you're after. Walking in the door and having an incentive like a rent-a-voucher is golden. it's not used enough, I don't believe. But I will go back to the last point and back also to the location. Safety and security is top of mind. And I believe when we are approaching, and again, it's a priority for Atlantis, to look at folks who need the care 24/7. And for that, I think it's becoming an increasing issue for the population with developmental disabilities, with lower IQs, that you're looking at units that are secure, that have eyes on the population. But it is also an element of designing those properties that is a challenge for smaller towns, for smaller communities, for the Front Range. So I don't know if that gets to the mark that you wanted me to hit, but if there's a follow-up question, please ask.
No, I appreciate that, and I'm going to let our members in just a minute. Amy, I'm curious, kind of at the intersection of a few points Pat made on getting to some of that geographic distribution while underscoring the importance of access to critical services, whether that's transportation, medical, and others, and this balance of carrots and sticks, and Pat making the case that we've got a lot of rules. What we need are some incentives and ensuring things are going to their key purposes. What have you seen work well that maybe we want to consider scaling, doing more of, or bringing to Colorado to increase the units and the broad availability of them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a smart approach to think about and to know where the people are that you're trying to serve, right? And there is sort of an urban and rural disconnect, and there may be a lack of other supportive services in rural communities that might be necessary for individuals with certain types of disabilities. At the same time, I think that it is wise to consider that, you know, under Section 504, we have a minimum requirement for federally assisted units in terms of physical accessibility, but it is a floor. And so the state can always look at raising that floor based on local data. So I can tell you just from top of mind, when I look at the American Housing Survey based on national data, we're talking about 30% of the entire US population of renters have disabilities and are eligible for HUD assistance. So 30% of people eligible for HUD assistance also have a disability of any kind, and they are at or below 50% AMI. So we go with the 50% because there are very few that fall within the 50 to 80%. But almost half of individuals and families who are receiving HUD assistance have a household member with a disability. So there's a huge difference between people that we are actually serving versus need. But even when you look at the whole, I think only 25% of people who are eligible for HUD assistance with or without disabilities are currently receiving HUD assistance because of generally the lack of federal resources. And that's a huge gap to think about. That can be pretty overwhelming to think about. From my experience within HUD, I know that we have, let's just say, with or without a disability, we have public housing authorities in urban areas that may have wait lists that are 1 or more years long. So we typically think of a wait list being excessive if it's a longer than 1 year. But we also have units and housing authorities in rural areas. We have housing authorities that have below 70% occupancy in certain parts of the country. And other parts of the country, we have overwhelming demand and need for housing. So there is a disconnect there, but it seems to be driven by some of the things that Pat talked about and other things, economic opportunity being another one. I think that though pairing the need based on geography and looking at the data and then considering the kinds of incentives that you might be able to offer at the state level. For example, incentivizing through the competitive tax credit program, additional accessible units, or adding in geography where you think there's a need. I've certainly seen that. We recently reviewed every QAP at the state level across the country and saw that many states are incentivizing going above and beyond the minimum requirement for accessible units. So that's definitely something that you could consider.
Thank you, Amy. And certainly the QAPs have been a lever that this group has talked about. I appreciate your sharing and just being so transparent about the requirement, the need, and the numbers. And as the neutral facilitator, it's not my place to comment on the requirements versus the need, but I'm going to bring our group in. And members, I'll ask you to, if you're able to click on it easily, use the raise your hand so I can see you. And you know me, if I don't see hands up, I'm going to start polling people. But who from our subcommittee has questions for one or both of the panelists as you think about our charge of identifying need, strategies, incentives, and programs to expand that inventory and meet Colorado's needs over the next 10 years? Brian, jump in, please.
Well, thanks, Eric, and thanks, Amy and Pat. It's really good to see you all. Pat, it's really great to see you. So, Amy, you mentioned you all looked at the QAPs across the country. Did you look at anything else in terms of like, are there incentives that go along with, increased requirements in a QAP? I think one of the things that at least I'm pretty cautious and conscious of is legislating the QAP. Here, there's kind of another process by which that comes into being. So, influencing that process, if need be. And I don't know, where your sort of evaluation of the states lie. But was there any sort of other analysis that kind of came along with that, like you get a bonus, or there's gap filler, or there's some other pieces, kind of that incentive piece that Pat talked about that could go along with points that you might get through the QAP process? Does my question make sense?
So to be transparent, I don't have super in-depth knowledge on LIHTC. I have, I would say, a pretty surface level, but our curiosity is around, really, are there states doing more at the local level than is required at the federal level by the federal floor? And so that was really the question. And we discovered that yes, some states are at the minimum, other states have incentivized going beyond the minimum, or incentivize certain types of housing. Like, for example, I don't know that it will be maybe a surprise for this group, but I think that there has been a trend to incentivize senior housing for many years through the QAP process, and that oftentimes senior housing might be seen as more palatable in some way for a community to adopt. But I think that the real question is, what does the data support, and who is eligible to live in the units at the end of the day? Like, where is the real need? So Pat I don't mean to throw Pat this question, but from his perspective, he might have some other ideas about what can be done in the QAP world that I just can't offer beyond what I've seen at the surface level.
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer, Brian, if that's okay. Not to get too far in the weeds, because I know what that does to people. So Colorado, every state is a little different in the way it operates its tax credit program. In Colorado, it's a scoring system, and you can adjust those points to emphasize the type of priorities you have, and not to get anywhere close to the legislated solution to this, but the governor in Colorado signs off on the QAP. At least that used to be the case, and that's where often you find changes made and align with the priorities. And I think they're there, but one that we do enjoy when housing is built for homeless individuals, and we certainly have availed ourselves of this, is we get a bonus in our developer fee, and that bonus goes to services, and it amounts to a lot of money, and it's a 5% bonus, and it goes, tying units to services is absolutely key to allowing people to live more independent than they have maybe in the past. So that would be one thing to take a look at. It's not only the maybe establishing a few more points, but also on the incentive side, tying it to broadening the developer fee bonus. The trouble with the point system is that everybody who's skilled at this gets your qualified points, and from there it becomes almost kind of a locational equity decision where things are built and who they're serving in the priorities of various communities. I hope I didn't double speak on a few of those things.
Thank you. Brian, helpful on where you were interested? Excellent. I'm going to bring in Paul, and then Anais, I'll get over to you next.
Hi, I guess this question's mostly for Amy. You mentioned other states do different things differently. I've been kind of picking up different codes, like in New Jersey, I think they require 100% type A units. California, there's a certain requirement for ground floor units. Are there model codes or policies that you think different states or that we should look to as maybe good examples?
I wouldn't want to speak to a model, but what I can do is, if it would be helpful, is I could share after the call with the organizer the states that we reviewed that had these different requirements in the QAP that you might look to. I do also know that there are some local communities, like I think the city of Petaluma in California recently adopted a visitability ordinance that requires all new construction within the city limits to have some level of visitability based on the definition that the city has adopted, which would be a different requirement than a federal accessibility requirement. But I do know that is one thing that has been on my radar, and there may be some other local communities that have also adopted stronger requirements as well. But I can share some of the information, the QAPs that we reviewed that had greater requirements if you're interested in that, if that's appropriate.
That'd be cool. And I guess just to clarify, it's only in QAPs. It's not in broader building code. You didn't survey that. Yeah.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Nice. Let me get you in here.
Yes, thank you. So I live in the world of cognitive accessibility, and we touch a lot on physical accessibility here. But when it comes to cognitive accessibility, it relies heavily on staffing, on training, on administrative practices that are cognitively inclusive, using plain language versus more of that built environment. So do you feel that the federal assistance, and maybe this question is for Amy more, do you feel that the federal assistance accounts for that, the staffing needs that are required to really make things cognitively accessible for the tenants as well? Related to tax credits, Are there bonuses that can be advocated for when it comes to those incentives, when you speak to those staffing needs to make things cognitively accessible? I've spoke with a number of local agencies who have tried applying to administer Section 8, and what they reported to me at least was that the funds don't fully cover the staffing needs needed to manage that Section 8 voucher and ensure that those clients don't have that revolving door of homelessness, because that's what we're seeing here in Larimer County, is that those clients with IDD, because it's a more invisible disability and requires more of that interactive accessibility, that these clients through inadvertent discriminations are having to, go in and out of housing. So yeah, just those three questions. Does the federal assistance cover that staffing need for cognitive accessibility? And how do we make that Section 8 process, more descriptive and more kind of inclusive of those needs?
Yeah, it's a little bit it's challenging. There are layers here from a fair housing perspective. One is that it depends on the type of housing and whether or not there is a supportive services contract that would go with that property. So it really depends. There are resources that I can share. You probably are already aware of them, of the different properties that may exist in the area that would have those types of services that are attached to the unit. So there may be, in particular, some 811 properties in the area. There may be properties that are not 811, but that do have some type of supportive services contract. And then a lot of it, I would say, I would agree that there's very likely not enough supportive services in many locations, and that it falls to reasonable accommodations process, where there can be a challenge just in terms of lack of understanding or lack of training on the part of the property management. And so I imagine from your part that probably requires a lot of education that you're having to do for property management, and that we have to do as well. I mean,
Yes.
The majority of the fair housing complaints that we receive at HUD are based on disability, and the majority of those complaints are allegations of denials of reasonable accommodations requests. And so I think that absent additional funding and additional supportive services or partnerships with other local organizations where there may be some offsite services that could be available to a person on a voluntary basis, right? Because our housing has to be available with or without the need for a reasonable accommodation. And so it's challenging because we leave it to the person, and we have to be mindful about that and just ensure that the person is meeting the requirements of the tenancy. So I think a lot of it, yeah, like supportive services contracts, and then just having the networks in place is probably one of the most critical things I can suggest.
And just to follow up on that, you mentioned compliance activities where you guys are providing that kind of oversight as, that entity that you are. Is that part of the compliance activities for how they're complying to cognitive accessibility as well as the physical pieces?
So I'll give it a brief rundown. So if we were to have information that would warrant the opening of a compliance review, we would look generally at the policies and procedures that are in place for any recipient of federal financial assistance. So if it's a PHA or if it's a multifamily housing provider who is a recipient of HUD funding, we would look globally at their program. If there was a specific complaint on that basis, we would look into that specific issue. If we saw it as an issue whenever we were conducting a more global type of review, then we would definitely address it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Anais, and thank you, Amy. Rochelle, let me get you in here.
Goodness gracious. Thank you so much. And thank you to Amy and Pat for joining us today. It's been really informative. Most of, I think, everything that Amy has directed is about those wraparound services. And I think that Pat could probably back me up on some of this, that the Centers for Independent Living around the state, for the most part, have dropped their housing programs directly of managing of Section 8 housing vouchers. I think my agency is one of the last ones besides Colorado Springs that has the program still. And we manage about 140 housing vouchers at just my agency. And so if you take the population of Weld County, and it's just within Weld County, we serve 7 counties, but just the Weld County area, that's a really high percentage of the population as compared to Denver. But there's, as you said, and as was already pointed out, the funding is not there. That's one full-time person running that. And so the ability to provide those wraparound services, we've had to be really creative about how to do that and to continue, because if we gave up the program, there's nobody else to take it over. We don't have anyone else to manage those vouchers. Is there any federal model or any other state model that provides wraparound service, financial support, resources? I mean, I know that the state of Colorado is very generous to its Centers for Independent Living, as in contrast to many other states within the United States. But still, it's not enough to provide those full services, to provide full housing services. Are there any other states that have modeled those wraparound services being supported through their CILs?
I don't have I can't think of an example off the top of my head, Rochelle, and I'm sorry, but what I will do is I'll share with you a resource center that the Administration on Community Living and HUD have put together that has resources around supportive services, housing, healthcare, and the like. And I think that you might be able to find some examples through that resource center. I'm sorry, I wasn't prepared for that today, but I do think that that might be a helpful resource to take a look at.
Yeah, that's all right. And we actually contribute a lot of
You
information.
do? Okay.
ACL. Well,
Yeah.
ACL is our federal partner.
Yes.
Yeah, for Part C funding. So we do contribute a lot of information to that. And it seems that Colorado is actually one of the states that are a little bit ahead of the game on this, but I was just really hoping maybe Ohio or California or there's somewhere in there a little bit more. And I don't know if Pat has anything to add to that, of maybe some ideas about how to just due to Atlantis's history and how that, separation came to be, if that's maybe the model that we should follow at other centers, or if there's some sort of incentivification we can do within this language that would help those wraparound services.
Well, the wraparound services are absolutely key to both the individual and the housing to succeed. We, as far as resources, we do tie our units to a variety of services, and the funding sources really do vary. We have our own that we incorporate into the properties, and that means we underwrite a property to provide some type of annual support to the services in dollars. And that's before we get, as I mentioned before, we often use this 5% bonus that we get in developer fee to apply to that. That 5%, probably at a minimum, is $500,000. So it's not little, it's not chump change. But I do think, and this is, again, I come from the housing perspective. So I say that because I'm making a judgment here. The efficiency of the services, I have tenants that have 5 case managers or more. When you're dealing with a limited resource, the efficiency of delivery of services just doesn't exist. There's no one, um, so I say that I watch it. I can't impact it except those programs that I do direct. I make sure that doesn't happen. And again, to the efficiency, I don't believe we do a good enough job at being able to decide how much independence someone can actually, how they can live their life. We hope and we wish, and everybody desires as much independence as we can provide. But the revolving door of people falling out of housing could slow down if we just thought a little bit more about starting with more services for that individual and then graduating to less, rather than placing them in a situation where they're not going to thrive. And the bottom line for any of our residents is, are they thriving? Can they thrive in their current residence? When it gets to folks with developmental disabilities, that is a big spectrum to think about, and it's something that we are looking to tackle. A wide spectrum, I should say.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Rochelle. I know Pat and Amy, we asked you to stick around till 4, so I'm going to let you go just momentarily. I will ask for your permission to follow up with you as our members have questions, but I'd like to invite each of you to, in a couple of minutes, share any final thoughts for us, and whether that's ways to make sure that Colorado doesn't view the floor as the ceiling, Amy, as we've talked about, or Pat, if you want to offer any thoughts on both those low-hanging fruits, the basic things that this group should make sure we get right, as well as either of you want to offer those aspirational things where Colorado really could set a new standard. And Amy, I'll invite you with final thoughts first.
Yeah, well, again, thanks so much for inviting HUD. And I would just say that as you continue your process in developing your recommendations, if you have specific HUD questions, please just continue to reach out and we'll find the right person to attend your next meeting or to answer any specific questions that you have. I'm always available as a fair housing resource, and I love talking about this stuff. And like I said, I lived in Colorado, and so I feel very happy to talk to Colorado people. One thing I wanted to mention, Rochelle, that I thought of, and you probably already are aware, I thought of after your question was, and this is pretty small scale so far, but I don't know if you've heard of or reached out to the Kelsey in California. That might be something that you would want to look into. It's a model of housing developer in the Bay Area that is building some pretty innovative disability forward housing, and is organized and operated by people with disabilities. And so there's really a lot of thought into it, but more for this conversation, in order to make that happen, there has to be a lot of creative financing. And so I know, just based on conversations that I've had with the Kelsey, as well as reviewing their materials, that there are multiple public and private partnerships, both in terms of the development, but as well as services that might be offered to residents. So while it's not a large scale best practice or model, I would say that it's definitely new and innovative and something worth looking into, to get to your question. I would just say I really, again, appreciate having the opportunity to hear the concerns that you all have spoken about today, as well as your perspective, Pat, as a developer of affordable and accessible housing, because these are things that I take back, I take to heart and I take to my leadership. And so I'm happy to answer any questions or continue the conversation. And I do agree that I think Colorado has been working on some innovative projects for a long time. I think the C# was a really innovative model around persons leaving prison with co-occurring mental health or substance use disorders. And I think that had some great success. And that was I think, federal state partnership. And so, hopefully more of those types of opportunities will come along the way. But I know that the major one, it seems like, is just finding the money and finding the resources to, I guess, address the problems that we all are aware are existing. And so I just applaud your efforts and thanks so much.
Thank you, Amy. And to be very clear, I am in no way kicking either of you off the call. I welcome you sticking around for the group discussion. I just want to respect your time and thank you. Pat, your thoughts on anything from what questions should I have asked that I didn't? What should we be talking about? And what words of wisdom, given your 40 plus years in the space, do you have for this group as we start digging in over the summer into making recommendations to report back out?
Well, I certainly appreciate the opportunity, and for Amy, for what it's worth, my roots start with HUD. So I think I don't think we take full advantage of the development community, and that is for-profit and nonprofit. There is no reason that every development that's going on in Colorado, whether it's renovation of existing buildings or new, shouldn't have more housing for people with disabilities. And I think we have to dispel any myth by identifying how things are linked together for the private enterprise to build the housing that's needed. And I won't go down. Certainly, I'll listen a lot to connecting that to services. I believe that is the most difficult job in front of us. But as far as creating more inventory, that is a welcome mat that's standing in front of all of us. That every whether it's the projects that are awarded low-income housing tax credits, whether the projects are awarded private activity bonds without, with non-competitive credits, whether they're state credits, there's a lot of housing being built. And there's no reason that every one of those properties shouldn't have, and I would say certainly 5% is the floor, that it should be double or tripled. We try to integrate our communities by income, by any number of needs. And that's why I know there's a real opportunity out there to really piggyback on the private enterprise that's out there building. If anybody wants to talk about that roadmap in the future, I'd be happy to do that. Again, I will underscore the need for not more regulation. Not that I know it well, but really people respond far better to incentives that are put in front of them, and certainly willing to discuss those as well.
Thank you, Pat. And I expect we will take you up on that offer to follow up on both the roadmap and on some of the ideas on incentives and others. Amy and Pat, truly thank both of you for making yourselves available. Invite you to stick around for the next 20 minutes if you'd like, and certainly understand if you have other obligations. We're going to go into a little bit just of a debrief as a group here. And this is going to be one of those places where I am going to just start calling on people. We really are at a pivot point in our committee's work. We'll have some more conversations with folks like Chaffa and some of the research that you all have asked for. But come June, I think we're going to be sitting down and we'll talk about even getting together in person or hybrid around a table, a big whiteboard. it's going to be time to start taking a lot of the smart thinking and brainstorming and bold vision that a lot of folks have laid out, and starting to name all of the levers we have, from legislation and regulation to how things are implemented, to how things are enforced, to how we work with our partners in the nonprofit and private sector. But I want to now spend some time asking everyone to reflect on what we just heard from Amy and Pat, and where, if at all, it shaped, shifted, or added to your thinking, or what it makes you think that we need to spend some time digging a little more into to be able to start making recommendations. And I'm going to go just in random order of where people are on my screen. Cassidy, I will apologize that you pop up in the center of my screen. So I'm going to call on Cassidy first, and then Rochelle. But Cassidy, would love your thoughts on what you heard today and how it fits with everything we've been talking about for the last 4 or 5 months.
Yeah, I really appreciated the discussion today. I thought I learned a lot and I have a lot to digest from it. I enjoyed our conversation about, federal laws being a floor, not a ceiling. And particularly, I thought Pat's comments about how to make spaces more adaptable were super interesting, because I know the Fair Housing Act, which applies to private housing providers. We talked a lot about like federally funded housing providers who are subject to greater requirements, but the Fair Housing Act providers have adaptability requirements that, in my opinion, are pretty underwhelming. And so I think I guess at first blush, I always think adaptability never really satisfies me. I don't want to just talk about adaptability. I want to talk about more accessible units, right? But I thought his points about adaptability and, increasing square footage, thinking about doorways, just like some really basic steps, I thought were really interesting and I want to reflect more on.
Thanks, Cassidy. And I will tee up. Carrie is probably going to follow up with all of you. I'm putting you on the spot for your takeaways now. If you're like me, you're going to get to the dinner table this evening and say, you know what I should have said. Carrie's going to follow up with you and give you that opening. I just want to hit kind of a knee-jerk reaction, what you're thinking right now and in this moment. Rochelle and then Paul.
Well, thank you. I do go back to the same thing. I'm not sure that I would sit at my dinner table tonight and think that I should have, because I think every single night is that the key to this, and this is just part of the daily conversation that we have in managing Section 8 vouchers and in the consumers that we see daily, and that the other 8 centers for independent living are seeing on a regular basis, is that those wraparound services are dropping away in Colorado. We recently had a change from HCPF that changed the mileage allowance for Medicaid rides. And if you're somebody who lives in Cortez and you need to go to the doctor, you no longer have any supported transportation, because everything's more than 25 miles, 50 miles round trip away from you. And so the concern about those support services going away also takes away people's independence and their ability to live in accessible housing. So the foundation is gone before we even build the house. And I know that was an intentional metaphor, but those wraparound services are so critical. And my concern is around the resources to find them. We know that we're very much supported by the governor and by our state with state general funds for Centers for Independence Living, more so than in many other states in the union, but it's still not enough to have kept all of the Centers for Independent Living in the business of managing Section 8 housing vouchers. And I don't know where those resources are going to come. So my biggest concerns are around figuring out, we can make all of the recommendations we possibly can think of around, tax incentives for developing and the units being there, and then people not being successful in those units because the wraparound services aren't there. We absolutely know and can provide data to the state and, many, 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 practical examples of why, when you take away those wraparound services, people are less successful in living independently. And so the amount of money that saves eventually down the road is found, but we have to, kind of pony up those resources first and foremost. And I just don't know where those are going to come from. So that would be my dinner discussion every single night, I think.
And Rochelle, I appreciate it. I appreciate your persistence and passion on it. And what I want to say to this group, at the start of every meeting, I rattle off what we are legislatively required to address: the inventory, the mechanisms. That said, like everything we're talking about, I hope what we're required to do is the floor of what you all do and not the ceiling. And by that, I mean, if there are additional things we need to recommend, whether that's wraparound services or further future work, I want everybody to bring that to the table and view our charges as the floor, and the Coloradans deserve as the North Star of where we're going. So let's keep pushing that. Paul, and then Anais.
I guess I got 3 takeaways. First, Amy, I looked at the Cassidy. I have 11 web tabs open to read. There's a ton of resources there. So I'd encourage everybody else to Google it. Second, Pat's question about, are we using the units we already have? I thought that was really profound and maybe a tangible way to look at some data here. And then I guess finally, Pat's comment that the 5% maybe should be the floor, and that this is easy and we should do it on every project. Ever since I learned New Jersey requires 100% type A for their elevator served buildings, I'd been kind of digesting that. And I think that is easy. What I struggle with is those 10 unit or less projects, the infill ones that are those oddballs that don't have a center corridor and an elevator. And so maybe just suggest a friendly amendment that there should be a carve out for smaller projects, or a strategy for whole communities to look at their whole portfolio or a wider portfolio of housing and projects within that community to provide that greater percentage.
Thank you, Paul. And Anais, as I bring you in, I do need to note it's 4:15. We have on our agenda, this would be public comment. I've received no requests yet. I do see, in addition to DORA staff and some staff from across the Lieutenant Governor's office, including Senior Policy Advisor and Chief of Staff, there are a few folks online who may be members of the public. If you would like to address this committee, drop me a note in the chat and let me know, and we'll get you pulled in. Otherwise, I'm just going to continue this conversation with our members. Anais, and then Karen.
Yes. Processing. I am trying to remain hopeful and try to stay grounded in the fact that, yeah, I looked at the Kelsey and it looks amazing. So it's helping me be grounded on the fact that we don't have to fully reinvent the wheel, that there are people and individuals out there that are doing this work and are trying to put in all these little puzzle pieces that we're talking about: wraparound services, advocacy, a partnership between public and private entities. There are people that are doing it. So really motivated to hear from these individuals to see how they, how they're resolving the issues that we're talking about in their own projects and missions. So trying to remain hopeful. A lot of what we talk about is relating to regulations versus incentivizing. I think as a disability advocate, I fall heavily on the regulation end, just because I'm having to live in the client's experiences with them and really empathizing with their need to have someone who looks out for them in that way. And so that's always where I lean into, is how can we regulate training? How can we regulate that accessibility? Or, how do we ensure these things? But I am trying to shift a little bit towards that incentive end, because that is what's going to be ultimately required for those people who aren't living in those experiences like I am. So just curious and wondering how we can incentivize around those more nuanced pieces of wraparound services, of incentivizing through tax credits, the additional staffing needs that it really takes for clients to feel that they can access their community fully, cognitively and physically. So just
Thank-
processing a lot.
No, thank you, Anais. And I want to particularly just honor your willingness to name that tension.
Yeah.
And I think that really is the power of this group, is so many folks coming from different backgrounds, and not just listening, but hearing one another and taking that in. And I think that's how we're going to be able to make recommendations that can move the dial, is that combination of lived and professional experiences and perspectives of the realities. So thank you.
Yes.
Karen, and then Brian.
Thanks. Well, I took lots of notes. So I appreciate that because I am a bit of a processor. But some of my takeaways, I think a lot of our conversation with Pat and Amy, we're focusing on multifamily and rental projects. And I come from the lens of home ownership, affordable home ownership. So I was definitely trying to translate some of that into the work that we do in terms of ownership opportunities. With that too, my call right before this was with the Division of Housing as they're looking at guidelines for their Prop 123 money in terms of home ownership. And so, I wrote down they're looking at some bonus structures, which I think are similar to what we're talking about in terms of like incentivizing for the competitive tax credit. So I wrote that down as something to think about as we're looking at what we're doing in the future. I do like, and I think this is actually different than what Anais was saying, but it's going back to the incentives piece. When it comes to those of us that are developing the housing, I do think we respond better to incentives than regulations. I can't speak to the wraparound services and the support services because that's not what I do, but I did want to make that distinction in terms of incentives for developers. And then I think just the other takeaway too is just, what other partnerships? I mean, I do know enough about like Division of Housing and how they're funding some with supportive services, but the need I'm learning again, because it's not my typical space, is so great. So what else is out there to pair with our housing inventory charge that we have, and how, are there other, how do we do more with partnerships, I guess, is something that I wrote down as a takeaway.
Thank you, Karen. Brian.
Sure. Yeah, a lot to walk away with today. I think I've been thinking about that, and I hope it's not like a dichotomy of regulation versus incentive. I think there's probably a happy medium that takes into account both. So just sort of thinking to that through a little bit, and thinking about my community, my membership, kind of how they will respond. I know everybody wants more money to do the things that they're trying to do, but we do live in an environment of limited resources. So how can we maximize those resources to maximize the amount of perhaps units that are being created or rehab for folks with disabilities? And so just thinking through that a little bit, that idea of 5% being a floor, not a ceiling, I think is really important for us to really think through with our recommendations and how we move forward with that. This is the second time that the Kelsey's come up. Derek, did I get you that information last time? I'm trying to recall. Okay.
No.
So the Kelsey is trying to, just so folks know, Kelsey is trying to move into Colorado. So I can get you the information for Lisa, who I've been speaking with. Their federal policy person is actually here in Denver. And they are looking to find some partners to work on development here in the state. So as soon as we get off, I'll shoot you an email with contact information.
That'd be great. Thank you, Brian. We don't have anybody for public comment, which means I'll probably get everybody off of here at least a few minutes early. I want to cover a few administrative items, and I'm going to repeat my thanks. First and foremost to Pat and Amy for joining us. I know you both have full plates with everything that you're already doing on these topics and others. So grateful for you making time available. I also owe a big thanks to Josh Winkler in the Lieutenant Governor's office, who, true to the Lieutenant Governor's commitment and Josh's commitment, has been one of our strongest thought partners in identifying resources and experts. And then I have to say, I sometimes have the easy job of showing up and facilitating and talking with everybody. My colleague Carrie, I think, has had about 120 phone conversations with different panelists across all of the subcommittees. So Carrie, thank you for all of that work and getting us with Pat and Amy and other members of HUD and the folks coming up next month. On some administrative notes, a couple of asks. One, I am going to ask you in the coming days, reflect on today and where we've come so far and start making some notes of specific ideas or general concepts that you think we need to start being ready to put on the table for consideration. I'm not saying get ready to propose a specific solution, although you're welcome to bring that, but we are at that pivot point where we're going to need to start putting recommendations and ideas on the table. A few other quick things. I mentioned at the top of the call, we realistically are going to need more than our once a month meetings between now and September. I think it's most likely that at least 2 of those months, we're going to need to squeeze in a second meeting. And I know that's a big ask given what you're all already generously giving. So we'll work with all of you and your schedules, but I want to make sure that we do this work right and that we're not rushing our recommendations given the seriousness of this. And on that note, there's 2 things over the summer we're going to ask everybody to consider. One, I personally love the energy of sitting around a big table with people, of having a whiteboard and sticky notes and all of my silly arts and crafts to put it all visually there. I know that's not always possible for everybody, but I'm going to ask you to give that some thought and we'll figure out what we can do about maybe getting the group together or getting some type of hybrid environment for some extended work sessions. On a similar note of summer, we've heard from a number of folks, it's about to be Colorado summer. Even though Mother Nature is a little confused over the next 6 weeks, we know it's going to get beautiful. And we know whether you've got kids or you like getting outdoors, whether that's local paths or Red Rocks, not everybody wants to spend their late afternoons with me. So we are going to leave the topic open and we'll survey all of you if you want to think of summer hours for these meetings and adjust our time earlier in the day. So you're not spending the end of the day right up until the rush hour with us. If you prefer to keep these times, we certainly will. Just want to give you all the option to enjoy the summer. With that, it's 4:26. I'm going to give everybody big 4 minutes back. But first, as I do every meeting, my true thanks. You guys, your expertise, your passion, your hearts, and your smarts are what's going to make us able to move the dial. So thank you for continuing to contribute so much to this. If anything comes to mind between now and when we get together next, you know how to get hold of Carrie and me, and we will certainly be reaching out to all of you. But thank you all very much for your time today.